Think twice before accepting a letter from an unknown sender, especially if it includes documents about inheriting a house from a relative you've never met. What seems like a cozy country house could cost you everything. Sadly, Daniel realized this too late. When Daniel received word of an unexpected inheritance, a remote farmhouse from a distant relative he'd never met, it felt like a sign, a chance to escape his cramped city apartment and start over. The letter from the lawyer was brief, revealing little about the relative or the history of the property, only that it was now his. Eager for a change, Daniel packed his few belongings and made the drive into the countryside. The farmhouse stood at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by untamed woods that seemed to press in from all sides. It had a timeless, eerie quality. The paint was peeling, the roof sagged in places, and the shutters hung crookedly from the windows, but it held a rustic charm that Daniel found oddly welcoming. It was dusk when he arrived, and the setting sun cast long, ominous shadows across the property. Inside, the house was as aged as its exterior. Dust coated the furniture, cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air carried a faint, musty scent. As he wandered through the rooms, he found them sparsely furnished, save for a few remnants of the previous owner. In the living room, an old photo album sat on a coffee table, its cover cracked and worn with age. Curious, Daniel opened the album. The photographs were black and white, depicting a family, 2 parents and 3 children, posing in front of the farmhouse. As he flipped through the pages, something peculiar caught his attention. One child's face was scratched out in every picture. The marks were deliberate, as if someone had furiously scraped away the image with a knife or nail. Disturbed but intrigued, Daniel spent the rest of the evening exploring the house. In the upstairs bedroom, he found a trunk tucked away in the closet. Inside were more photographs, letters, and journals, all belonging to the family in the album. The letters were fragmented and cryptic, often referencing the forgotten one, and containing warnings like, "Never leave the door unlocked," and "Don't go into the room." The journals began innocuously, chronicling the family's life on the farm. But as Daniel read on, the tone shifted. The later entries became frantic, describing strange occurrences, unseen footsteps, whispers in the night, and objects moving on their own. The final entry simply read, "We cannot stay. It wants us gone." That night, as a storm rolled in, Daniel tried to shake off the unease. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose shutters and creating a symphony of creaks and groans within the house. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, when a sound pierced the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first he thought it was a branch against the window, but the sound was too deliberate, too precise. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Grabbing a flashlight, Daniel followed the noise to a door at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was locked. Earlier, he'd found a small brass key in the desk drawer of the study. Retrieving it, he slid it into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open to reveal a small, barren room. The walls were bare, but upon closer inspection, he noticed faint scratch marks covering every surface. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair, its back turned to him. The tapping stopped as soon as he stepped inside. The air grew unnaturally cold, and a chill ran down his spine. Then he heard it, a childlike whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Why did you forget me?" Daniel froze. He spun around, but the room was empty. As he backed out of the doorway, the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Why did you leave me here? Why did you forget me?" The door slammed shut on its own, nearly catching his fingers. Panicking, Daniel fled back to his bedroom, locking the door behind him. He didn't sleep that night, the whispers haunting him until dawn. The next morning, he packed his things, determined to leave the farmhouse for good. As he carried his bags to the car, he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him. He didn't dare look back. Driving down the dirt road, he finally began to relax. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. Sitting in the back seat was the shadowy figure of a child, its face obscured, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Daniel's car was found abandoned on the roadside several miles from the farmhouse. There was no sign of him. The farmhouse itself remains uninhabited, its legacy of mystery and dread preserved. Locals say it's cursed, its dark secrets waiting for the next unsuspecting heir. The lake stretched endlessly into the fog, its surface eerily calm. The rented boat carried 5 friends, Mark, Rachel, Emily, Chris, and Sarah, on what was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation. Laughter and chatter had accompanied them earlier, but as the fog thickened, their spirits dimmed. The world beyond the water disappeared, and a strange stillness fell over them. Mark was the first to notice the shape looming ahead, faint and shadowy against the wall of mist. "What is that?" he asked, pointing. The others followed his gaze. An old, massive ship, seemingly out of time, was anchored silently in the middle of the lake. Its dark silhouette was imposing, with sagging masts and torn sails that flapped in the still air. "That can't be real," Rachel muttered. "Maybe it's a floating museum," Chris suggested. Emily frowned. "In the middle of nowhere? Doesn't make sense." Curiosity got the better of them, as it always did. They brought their boat closer, the soft hum of the motor breaking the eerie silence. The ship's name, Evangeline, was barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint and algae. A rope ladder dangled from the side, beckoning them upward. "This is crazy," Sarah said, hesitating as the others prepared to climb aboard. "Just a quick look," Mark reassured her, though he didn't feel confident himself. One by one, they climbed onto the deck. The air felt different, colder, heavier, as though they'd stepped into another world. The deck was littered with debris, overturned barrels, shattered lanterns, and dark stains that hinted at violence. "This place has been here forever," Rachel whispered. Chris wandered toward the wheelhouse. "If it's abandoned, where's the crew? Someone had to anchor it." Inside, the wheelhouse was empty except for a rusted compass and an old captain's log lying open on a desk. The entries were faded but readable. "Day 32, whispers in the night. Men say they hear voices below deck," Emily read aloud. "Day 40, Jenkins vanished. We searched the entire ship, but he's gone." The entries grew more frantic until they stopped abruptly. "It just ends," Emily said, flipping to the last blank page. "Maybe the crew abandoned ship," Sarah offered, though her voice was shaky. Mark turned toward the stairs leading below deck. "Only one way to find out." They descended cautiously, their flashlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. The corridors were narrow, the wooden walls warped with age. A strange smell hung in the air, damp, rotting, and metallic. In the cargo hold, they found evidence of chaos: broken furniture, claw marks gouged into the walls, and a black, viscous substance pooled in the corners. The room felt alive, the air thick with unseen tension. "This was a mistake," Sarah whispered, backing toward the stairs. Before anyone could respond, a sharp clang echoed from above deck. They froze, their breaths hitching. "Did someone just drop the ladder?" Chris asked. Mark shook his head. "No one else is here." But the sound came again, closer this time. Then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. They turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was everywhere and nowhere at once. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice rising. They scrambled back up to the deck, but the ladder to their boat was gone. The fog had thickened, swallowing the water entirely. The lake, the horizon, even their own boat had disappeared. "This can't be happening," Sarah cried, gripping Emily's arm. The ship groaned beneath their feet, its timbers creaking as though it were alive. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by faint laughter. Shadows danced in the mist, humanoid shapes moving just beyond visibility. "Look," Mark shouted, pointing toward the bow. A figure stood there, a man in a captain's uniform, his face pale and sunken, his eyes black pits. Behind him, more figures emerged, each one gaunt and lifeless, their forms flickering like static on a broken screen. "They're the crew," Emily whispered. "They never left." The figures began to advance, their movements jerky and unnatural. "We have to jump!" Chris yelled. "There's nowhere to go!" Rachel screamed. The fog thickened further, pressing against them like a living thing. The figures closed in, skeletal hands outstretched. Mark swung a piece of debris at one, but it passed through the figure like smoke. The captain raised his hand, and the figures froze. "You've come too far," he said, his voice hollow and echoing. "Now you'll stay." The deck trembled violently, and the friends were thrown to the ground. The fog seeped closer, enveloping them. They screamed, but the mist muffled their cries. When the fog cleared, the lake was empty once more. The Evangeline drifted silently, waiting for the next group of curious souls to stumble upon it. And deep within its cursed halls, 5 new figures joined the ranks of the ghostly crew, their faces frozen in silent terror. When they moved into their new home, Sarah and Mark were excited for a fresh start. The small suburban neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, and perfect for raising a family. The house they chose backed onto a dilapidated lot with an overgrown playground hidden behind a rusted chain-link fence. At first, it seemed like an eyesore, just another neglected piece of land in need of care. But soon, it would become far more than that. It started on the first night. They were unpacking their boxes and setting up the living room when Sarah paused by the window. The moonlight was casting eerie shadows on the playground's old swings and merry-go-round. She thought she saw a faint movement, a quick creak of the swing as though someone had pushed it. Her heart dropped, but she brushed it off. Perhaps the wind. But the noises came again the next night. Mark was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Sarah heard the sound of faint laughter drifting through the air. She froze. It was a small sound, delicate and chilling, but unmistakable, a child's laugh. She called for Mark, but he hadn't heard anything. "It's probably just the wind," he assured her. But that evening, as they ate their meal, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Soon the sounds became more frequent. The playground seemed alive at night. The swings swayed back and forth as though propelled by unseen hands. The merry-go-round would creak under pressure, spinning ever so slightly without any visible force. Each time they looked out the window, they'd catch glimpses of movement. The faintest silhouette of a small figure darting across the snow-speckled grass, just out of sight. Sarah began having vivid dreams. In her dreams, she saw a child playing alone on the swings, their hair flying in the wind as they laughed. The child would stop playing at the sound of footsteps behind them and turn, their face hidden by a hood. In the dream, they would whisper, "They didn't find me." When she awoke, the dreams lingered. Her unease grew. One morning, unable to resist her curiosity any longer, Sarah ventured into the playground with Mark. The air was still, the fog heavy, and frost clung to the rusty chains of the swings. The merry-go-round was barely visible in the mist, looking like a dark relic of some forgotten time. They stepped through the snow toward the center of the lot, feeling the chill air sting their skin. "Something feels off," Mark said, his voice low. "Look at this," Sarah whispered as she noticed a patch of fresh footprints in the snow, small and childlike, leading toward the merry-go-round. They followed the trail, their breath visible in the cold air, until they reached the old, rusty structure. Sarah was struck by a sudden sensation, an overwhelming feeling that someone was watching them. Then she noticed it, a photograph pinned to a nearby wooden pole. With trembling hands, she pulled the paper free. The image was yellowed and aged with time, but unmistakable. A photograph of a smiling young child sitting on a swing, their cheeks flushed with joy. The child was wearing a coat, and in the background, was the very same merry-go-round they now stood in front of. The child's smile seemed distant and cold in the photo. But then Sarah noticed something else: the child's eyes. They were piercing and familiar, far too familiar. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. And then they heard it again, a sound, a small, faint shuffle behind them. They turned quickly, but there was nothing but fog and snow. Mark looked at her, his face pale. "Let's get out of here," he whispered. His voice was shaking. But as they began walking toward their house, they felt it, a tug on the back of Sarah's coat. Just one sharp pull. Frozen, they turned back. The merry-go-round was spinning now, slow and steady, even though there was no wind. In the distance, the sound of laughter rang again, a small, high-pitched giggle. They stared at the motionless structure, their hearts pounding. Their legs felt weak, their breaths came too fast. And then, they heard a whisper. It came from behind them, soft and slow. "They didn't find me." And as they turned back toward the house, they knew they could never unhear it. The playground behind their home would always be there, haunted by the laughter of a child and the memories of a mystery they could never solve.